On a quiet Sunday morning in September 2019, Houston police received a call that would shake an entire community. The voice on the other end was calm, almost detached. "I killed my wife," the caller said. "There's blood everywhere. You need to send someone." When officers arrived at the modest home on Maple Street, they found a man sitting on the front porch, his clothes soaked in blood, staring into nothing. Inside the house, they discovered a crime scene so violent that even veteran detectives had to step outside to compose themselves. But this wasn't just another domestic violence case. What investigators uncovered in the following hours would turn this tragedy into a national conversation about secrets, identity, and the deadly consequences of fear. This is the true story of Rachel Thompson and David Anderson, a couple everyone thought was perfect, until one devastating night proved that sometimes the people we think we know best are complete strangers. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. According to neighbors on Maple Street, David and Rachel Anderson seemed like the ideal couple. Margaret Chen, who lived 3 houses down, told investigators she'd see them every Sunday morning walking to the corner coffee shop, always holding hands. "They were the kind of couple that made you believe in love," she said in her police interview, "always smiling, always together." David Anderson was 35 years old, a construction foreman who'd lived in Houston his whole life. Co-workers described him as quiet, hard-working, the type who kept to himself. His supervisor, Mike Torres, told police that David was reliable, never caused problems, never showed any signs of aggression. "He was just a regular guy," Torres said, "the kind you'd want on your crew." Rachel Thompson was 32 when she married David. She worked as a hairstylist at Bella's Salon in downtown Houston. Her boss, Linda Martinez, described Rachel as talented and kind, someone clients requested specifically. "She had this gift of making people feel heard," Martinez told reporters after the tragedy. "Everyone loved her. She was gentle, soft-spoken, always remembered the little details about people's lives." But Martinez also noted something else. Rachel was intensely private. She never talked about her past, never mentioned family, and avoided personal questions with practiced ease. Court records show that David and Rachel met in early 2016 at a diner off Interstate 10. According to David's later testimony, it was love at first sight. They dated for 2 years before David proposed in 2018. Wedding photos entered as evidence during the trial show a small ceremony with about 20 guests, all from David's side. When prosecutors asked about Rachel's family, David testified that she'd told him they were estranged, that they didn't approve of her lifestyle choices. He never pressed for details. Phone records and text messages recovered by investigators painted a picture of a seemingly normal marriage in its early stages. Date nights, inside jokes, messages that ended with hearts, and "I love yous." David's mother, Patricia Anderson, testified that she adored Rachel from the first time they met. "She was the daughter I never had," Patricia said through tears on the witness stand. "I thought my son had finally found happiness." But according to David's testimony and statements from friends, things began to change about a year into the marriage. David confided in his friend James Parker that Rachel had become distant, secretive. "She's always on her phone, hiding the screen from me," David allegedly told Parker in July 2019, just 2 months before the murder. "She works late constantly, and when I try to talk about it, she shuts down." Parker testified that he'd advised David to suggest marriage counseling, but David said Rachel refused, insisting everything was fine. What David didn't know, and what police would later discover, was that Rachel had been living with a secret that she'd carried for years. A secret so carefully guarded that not a single person in Houston, aside from Rachel herself, knew the truth. According to medical records subpoenaed during the investigation, Rachel Thompson had been born biologically male in a small town in East Texas in 1987. Hospital records from a clinic in California showed that she'd undergone gender confirmation surgery in 2014, 5 years before meeting David. Legal documents revealed she'd legally changed her name in 2015 and moved to Houston shortly after, leaving her past behind completely. Dr. Sarah Williams, a psychologist who specializes in transgender issues and testified as an expert witness during the trial, explained that many transgender individuals choose not to disclose their history for safety reasons. The statistics are alarming, Dr. Williams told the court. Transgender women, particularly trans women of color, face disproportionately high rates of violence and murder. Many choose privacy not out of deception, but out of survival. But that privacy, that secret Rachel had worked so hard to protect, would ultimately lead to her death. According to phone records presented at trial, the night of September 24, 2019, started like any other. Rachel had texted David around 6 p.m. saying she'd be working late at the salon, doing inventory, but cell tower data told a different story. Rachel's phone pinged from locations nowhere near the salon that evening. When questioned about this during the investigation, detectives theorized that Rachel may have been meeting with someone, though they never determined who. What happened next comes from David Anderson's own testimony during his interrogation, corroborated by physical evidence found at the scene. According to David, Rachel had left her personal phone at home that night, something she rarely did. When it buzzed repeatedly around 7:30 p.m., David glanced at it. He testified that he saw multiple missed calls from an unlisted number and a text message that read, "We need to talk. Now." David told detectives that something in him snapped at that moment. All the months of suspicion, all the late nights, all the distance between them suddenly felt like confirmation of what he'd feared. "She's having an affair," David said he thought to himself. In his interrogation, David admitted that he made a decision that would change everything. He went into their bedroom and started searching through Rachel's belongings. What David found was not evidence of an affair. Hidden in a lockbox on the top shelf of their closet, beneath folded blankets, were documents that David said he couldn't comprehend at first. A birth certificate with a male name, medical records from a gender clinic in California, prescription bottles for hormone medications, photographs of a teenage boy who looked hauntingly familiar, and a journal filled with entries in Rachel's handwriting. Detective Lisa Martinez, the lead investigator on the case, testified about the contents of that journal. The entries spanned several years. One entry, dated June 2015, read, "Today I legally became Rachel. The name I've always known was mine. I'm starting over in Houston. New city, new life, new chance. Nobody has to know what came before. I can just be me." Another entry from early 2016, right around the time Rachel met David, was particularly telling. "I met someone today. His name is David. He looked at me like I was just a woman, not a trans woman, not someone with a complicated past, just me. I don't know if I'll ever tell him. Part of me thinks I should. Part of me is too scared. What if he rejects me? What if I lose this chance at normal love?" Detective Martinez testified that the journal entries showed an escalating pattern of anxiety. The longer Rachel waited to tell David, the harder it became. The later entries revealed Rachel's internal struggle, her fear that the truth would destroy her marriage, and her desperate hope that somehow she could keep both, her privacy and her love. According to David's testimony, he sat in that bedroom for hours, reading through the documents, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. He described feeling shock, betrayal, anger, and something else he couldn't name. When Rachel came home around 11 p.m., David was still sitting on the bed, the contents of the lockbox spread around him. In his police interview, David described Rachel's reaction. She walked into the bedroom and just froze. Her face went white. She knew immediately what I'd found. David told detectives that Rachel began crying, apologizing, trying to explain. According to David's account, which was the only account since Rachel didn't survive to tell her side, she'd explained about her transition, about moving to Houston for a fresh start, about her fear of rejection. "She told me she loved me," David said in his interrogation. She said everything between us was real except this one thing she'd kept hidden. She said she'd wanted to tell me so many times, but couldn't find the words. David testified that he asked Rachel to leave that night, that he needed time to think. Cell phone records confirm that Rachel checked into a nearby hotel at 12:30 a.m. Over the next 2 weeks, text message records show Rachel reaching out to David repeatedly, asking to talk, apologizing, expressing her love. David's responses grew increasingly cold and brief, according to evidence presented in court. On the evening of October 8, 2019, 2 weeks after David's discovery, Rachel sent David a text asking if she could come by the house to pick up some of her belongings. David agreed. Security footage from a neighbor's doorbell camera, presented as evidence, shows Rachel arriving at the house at 7:22 p.m. The timestamp on that footage would become crucial in establishing the timeline of events. What happened inside that house over the next several hours comes primarily from David Anderson's own confession to police, supplemented by forensic evidence that painted a picture of escalating violence. According to David's statement to detectives, Rachel arrived and went straight to the bedroom to pack some clothes. David admitted he'd been drinking before she arrived. Not heavily, he testified, but enough to lower his inhibitions. David told police that he followed Rachel to the bedroom and that they began arguing. He claimed Rachel tried to defend her decision to keep her past hidden, tried to explain her fear of rejection and violence. But David said he couldn't hear any of it. All he could think about was betrayal. In his interrogation, David's account grew darker. He admitted to saying cruel things, things he later claimed to regret. He said he called Rachel a liar, said their marriage was fake, said he felt disgusted and trapped. Detective Martinez noted in her report that David showed little emotion when recounting these details, speaking in a flat, detached monotone. According to forensic evidence presented at trial, the physical altercation began in the bedroom around 8:15 p.m. Blood spatter analysis indicated that the first blow occurred near the closet where Rachel had been packing. The medical examiner, Dr. Robert Chen, testified that Rachel sustained a blow to the face that split her lip and likely caused immediate bleeding. Defensive wounds on Rachel's hands and forearms indicated she'd tried to protect herself from subsequent attacks. David told police that after he hit Rachel the first time, something in him changed. "I just couldn't stop," he said in his confession. "Everything I'd been feeling for 2 weeks, all the anger and betrayal and shame, just came out." He admitted to striking Rachel multiple times with a bedside lamp, which was recovered at the scene with Rachel's blood and hair on it. But the forensic evidence revealed something even more disturbing. According to the medical examiner's report, there was a pause in the attack. Blood pooling patterns indicated that Rachel had been on the floor, bleeding but still alive, for several minutes before the fatal injuries occurred. During this time, police believe David left the bedroom. Kitchen drawers in the house were found open, and a knife block on the counter was missing a large kitchen knife. That knife was later found next to Rachel's body. Detective Martinez testified that this pause was significant. It showed that David had time to think, time to stop, time to call for help. Instead, he made a choice to go to the kitchen, arm himself with a weapon, and return to finish what he'd started. The medical examiner testified that Rachel sustained multiple stab wounds, including fatal wounds to her chest and abdomen. Dr. Chen stated that based on the nature and number of wounds, Rachel likely died within minutes of the stabbing. David called 911 at 3:27 a.m., nearly 7 hours after Rachel had arrived at the house. The operator's recording, played in court, captured David's eerily calm voice. "I killed my wife. I need you to send police." When officers arrived, they found David sitting on the front porch. He was covered in blood but showed no signs of injury himself. He didn't resist arrest, didn't try to run, didn't ask for a lawyer. He simply said, "I did it. She's inside." The crime scene told its own story. Police photographs shown to the jury revealed a bedroom destroyed by violence. Blood spatter covered the walls in patterns that forensic experts said indicated a prolonged, brutal attack. Furniture was overturned. Rachel's suitcase lay open on the bed, clothes scattered around as if she'd never had a chance to finish packing. Detective Martinez testified that in her 20 years on the force, it was one of the most violent domestic crime scenes she'd encountered. Rachel's body was found on the floor between the bed and the closet. The medical examiner's report, read aloud in court, detailed injuries that made even hardened court observers visibly uncomfortable. Multiple blunt force trauma to the head and face, defensive wounds on both hands and forearms, 7 stab wounds to the torso, 3 of which were fatal. Dr. Chen testified that Rachel would have suffered tremendously before dying. Outside the house, neighbors had gathered in shock. Margaret Chen, who'd spoken so fondly of the couple just hours earlier, told reporters she'd heard nothing unusual that night. No screams, no sounds of struggle. The walls were just thick enough, police theorized, or perhaps Rachel had been too terrified to scream. As news of the murder spread, details about Rachel's past began to emerge. Someone, investigators never determined who, leaked information to the media about Rachel's transgender identity. Within hours, the story went from a local tragedy to national news. Reporters descended on the quiet Houston neighborhood. Vigils were organized. Protests erupted. Social media exploded with debates about disclosure in relationships, transgender rights, and whether David deserved any sympathy. Rachel's former therapist, Dr. Michelle Adams, spoke to reporters with permission from Rachel's estate. She described Rachel as a kind soul who'd struggled for years with fear of rejection. She just wanted to live authentically and be loved for who she was, Dr. Adams said. The fact that this fear ultimately led to her death is a tragedy that should shake all of us. David's family was devastated. Patricia Anderson released a statement through her lawyer. "We are heartbroken by the loss of Rachel, who we loved as a daughter. We are equally devastated by our son's actions, which we cannot comprehend or condone. We pray for Rachel's soul and for all those affected by this tragedy." Rachel's biological family, who had been estranged from her since her transition, released their own statement. "While we struggled to understand Rachel's choices in life, we never stopped loving our child. To lose them this way, to such senseless violence, is unbearable. We hope this case brings awareness to the violence that transgender people face every day." David Anderson's trial began in March 2020 and lasted 6 weeks. He was charged with second-degree murder. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Walsh, argued that regardless of David's emotional state, he'd had multiple opportunities to stop the attack and chose not to. "This wasn't a crime of passion that happened in a split second," Walsh told the jury in her opening statement. David Anderson struck his wife, watched her bleed, left the room, armed himself with a knife, and made a conscious decision to take her life. That's murder, plain and simple. The defense team, led by attorney Robert Foster, tried to argue extreme emotional disturbance. They claimed that the shock of discovering Rachel's past had caused a psychological break, a temporary loss of control. "My client was devastated by what he perceived as a massive betrayal," Foster argued. "He reacted in the worst possible way, yes, but his state of mind at the time must be considered." The prosecution brought forth devastating evidence. Text messages between Rachel and David showed that in the 2 weeks between discovery and murder, Rachel had been nothing but apologetic and loving. "I know you're hurting," one text read. "I'm so sorry I wasn't brave enough to tell you sooner. I love you, and I'll give you all the space you need." David's responses were cold, sometimes cruel. His final text to Rachel, sent just hours before she came to the house, simply read, "Fine. Come get your stuff. Be quick." Forensic experts testified about the timeline and nature of the attack. The pause between the beating and the stabbing became a focal point. Dr. Chen, the medical examiner, was asked by prosecutors how long Rachel might have been conscious during that pause. Based on her injuries at that point, she would likely have been conscious but severely injured, he testified. She would have been aware, in pain, possibly in shock. The courtroom fell silent. David's former co-workers testified about his character. "He never seemed violent," Torres said. "But looking back, I remember him talking about Rachel in the weeks before this happened. He seemed angry, almost obsessed with feeling like he'd been made a fool of." Rachel's salon owner, Linda Martinez, testified about Rachel's character and her fear. "She once told me, about a year before she died, that she was terrified of her past coming out," Martinez said through tears. "She said she'd rather die than face the judgment and violence that might come." The cruel irony of that statement wasn't lost on anyone in the courtroom. Expert witnesses debated the psychology of the case. Dr. Williams, the transgender issues expert, testified about the legitimate fears that lead many transgender individuals to keep their history private. Dr. Mark Harrison, a psychologist called by the defense, testified about the psychological impact of perceived betrayal in intimate relationships. But under cross-examination, he admitted that no level of emotional distress justifies murder. The most damaging testimony came from David himself. Against his lawyer's advice, David took the stand. He cried as he described his love for Rachel, his shock at discovering her past, his feeling of betrayal. But when Prosecutor Walsh cross-examined him, David's true feelings emerged. "You testified that you loved your wife," Walsh said. "Yet in your police interview you called her disgusting. You said you felt trapped. You said everyone would think you were, and I quote, some kind of fool or worse." "What did you mean by that, Mr. Anderson?" David stammered. He tried to explain that he was in shock, that he didn't mean those things. But Walsh pressed on. "Isn't it true that your primary concern wasn't about trust or honesty? Isn't it true that you were most worried about what other people would think of you, about your reputation, about your masculinity being questioned?" David's pause told the jury everything they needed to know. Walsh continued, "And when your wife came to your house that night, unarmed, just trying to collect her belongings, you chose to teach her a lesson, didn't you? You chose to make her pay not for lying, but for making you feel small." "Objection," the defense shouted. But the damage was done. David's own words, his own admissions, had convicted him. In his closing argument, defense attorney Foster made one last plea for mercy. David Anderson made a terrible mistake, a catastrophic error in judgment born from psychological anguish. He will live with the consequences of that night for the rest of his life. But remember that he too is a victim of deception. Prosecutor Walsh's closing was swift and powerful. Rachel Thompson was a human being who deserved to live. She made choices about her privacy that were hers to make. David Anderson decided that his wounded ego was worth more than her life. There's a word for that: murder. The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous: guilty of second-degree murder. David showed no visible reaction. His mother collapsed in the gallery, sobbing. Rachel's friends embraced, some crying in relief, others in continued grief. At sentencing, Judge Helen Rodriguez addressed David directly. "Mr. Anderson, you have been convicted of taking the life of Rachel Thompson, a woman who by all accounts lived with courage and authenticity in a world that often punished her for being herself. Whatever feelings of betrayal you experienced, nothing, absolutely nothing, justified your actions. You had countless opportunities to walk away, to seek help, to choose anything other than violence. You chose murder. I hereby sentence you to 25 years to life in state prison." As David was led away in handcuffs, Rachel's salon owner read a statement on behalf of Rachel's friends. Rachel was a light in this world. She brought joy, compassion, and beauty into the lives of everyone she touched. She deserved to grow old, to continue her work, to find peace. David Anderson stole that from her, from us, and from the world. We hope this sentence brings some measure of justice, though it can never bring Rachel back. Today, David Anderson is serving his sentence at a state prison in Texas. According to prison records, he's been a model inmate, quiet and compliant. He's participated in therapy programs and has written letters expressing remorse to Rachel's family. Those letters have all been returned unopened. David's mother, Patricia, visited him once shortly after sentencing. She later told a local reporter that she couldn't reconcile the son she'd raised with the man who'd committed such violence. "I lost two people I loved that night," she said. "Rachel, who was my daughter in every way that mattered, and my son, who I no longer recognize." Rachel's friends and the local LGBTQ community established the Rachel Thompson Memorial Scholarship, providing financial assistance to transgender youth pursuing careers in beauty and wellness. The scholarship has helped dozens of young people since its inception. An annual vigil is held on the anniversary of Rachel's death, drawing hundreds of supporters who gather to honor her memory and advocate for an end to violence against transgender individuals. The case sparked nationwide conversations about disclosure in relationships, transgender rights, and domestic violence. Legal experts debated whether non-disclosure of transgender status constitutes deception. Therapists and advocates argued that the real issue wasn't disclosure, but rather society's violent reaction to transgender identity. Statistical data shared in the wake of Rachel's death was sobering. According to the Human Rights Campaign, transgender people, particularly transgender women of color, face epidemic levels of violence. In the year Rachel died, at least 26 transgender individuals were murdered in the United States, most in intimate partner situations. Dr. Sarah Williams, who testified at the trial, has since spoken at conferences about Rachel's case. "The tragedy of Rachel Thompson is that she lived in fear for good reason," Dr. Williams said in a keynote address. "That fear was validated when the truth she'd been protecting cost her life. Until we create a society where transgender people can exist openly without fear of violence, we'll continue to see cases like this." The house on Maple Street where the murder occurred was sold at auction. The new owners, a young couple from out of state, were unaware of its history when they purchased it. When neighbors informed them, they considered selling but ultimately decided to stay, hoping to create new, peaceful memories in a space marked by tragedy. Margaret Chen, the neighbor who'd once called David and Rachel the perfect couple, spoke to a documentary filmmaker a year after the murder. "I think about them all the time," she said. "I wonder what signs I missed, what I could have done differently. But mostly I think about how we never really know what's happening behind closed doors. Everyone has secrets. The question is whether we've created a world where people feel safe sharing them." Rachel's journal, entered as evidence during the trial, was returned to her estate. Her final entry, dated October 7, 2019, one day before her death, read, "I'm going to pick up my things tomorrow. I don't know if David and I can fix this, but I have to try. I have to believe that love is stronger than fear, that honesty, even when it's hard, is worth it. I'm scared, but I'm going to try." That entry, read aloud during the trial, left many in the courtroom in tears. Rachel had been planning to have an honest conversation with David, to perhaps finally bridge the gap that secrets had created. She never got that chance. Think about this case for a moment. How would you react if you discovered a fundamental truth about your partner that they'd hidden from you? Would anger be your first response, or would you try to understand their fear? And more importantly, what kind of society have we built where people feel they have to choose between authenticity and safety, between living their truth and protecting their lives? These aren't easy questions, and there are no simple answers. But Rachel Thompson's death demands that we ask them. David Anderson made a choice that night. Not in a split second of uncontrollable rage, as his defense tried to argue, but in the minutes it took him to walk to the kitchen, select a weapon, and return to finish what he'd started. That choice ended a life, destroyed families, and left a community grappling with questions about love, truth, and violence. As one advocate said at Rachel's memorial, "Rachel just wanted what we all want, to be loved for who she truly was, to live without fear, to build a life filled with joy and purpose. The fact that she was killed for being herself should haunt us all until we build a world where that can never happen again." So we ask you, what do you think? How do you process a tragedy like this? Where does your sympathy lie? What changes need to happen to prevent future violence? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us where you're watching from, and if this story moved you, hit that subscribe button so you never miss our upcoming videos. Thank you for watching and for caring enough to hear Rachel's story to the very end.